And thank you all for coming out on this beautiful spring day. I know we all want to be outside as well, but I'm really excited to have this fantastic panel here today, and I want to thank everyone on the panel for being here. So my name is Shramoy Mitra, and I'm the curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Windsor, and I will introduce the moderator, Honor Ford-Smit, who has traveled from Toronto to come here to moderate the panel, and we thank her for that. And then Honor will introduce the panel and say a few words, and then introduce all the panelists as well. So today's panel discussion is called Representing Oneself and Another, and I will introduce Honor Ford-Smit. Honor Ford-Smit is Associate Professor and Coordinator of Community and Environmental Arts at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. Her most recent work focuses on memory, urban violence, and performance in Jamaican communities and includes the performance cycle Letters from the Dead, a series of public interventions commemorating those who have died as a result of neoliberal violence. Her publications include Lionheart Gal, Life Stories of Jamaican Women with Sistren, Kingston University of West Indies Press, 3 Jamaican Plays, 1976 to 1986, Kingston Paul Issa Publications, and My Mother's Last Dance, an anthology of poems, Toronto Sister Vision Press, available through University of Toronto Press. Welcome, Anna.
So you have your own mic. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the gallery. And thanks very much for coming out on this lovely afternoon when I'm sure you'd much rather be outside. As you know, my name is Honor Ford-Smit, and I'd like to thank the gallery for inviting all of us here, but in particular for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here for this exhibition, and I want to start by recognizing the fact that all of our labor depends on the labor of many generations that have come before us, and to recognize that we are on the space of First Nations people. And I want to particularly today recognize the presence of Trudy Torinus, who's sitting here in the gallery, who's Sigi's mom, who's come all the way from the Virgin Islands to be here. And so for those of us who have lost our moms, we really want to honor you because you're standing in for all the other moms that aren't here.
Thank you.
I want to also say that Trudy's work has been kind of integrated into a portion of Sigi's exhibition upstairs, so you can also take a look at that when you go there. So we come together this afternoon to put 3 very different exhibitions into dialogue with each other. Landmarks, Revolution, Into the Light, and we're working on it. 3 exhibitions. Oh, it's not we're working on it? Oh, I beg your pardon. We won't compete. We won't compete.
We're also
can't read. Not only can't talk, but can't read. Yeah, okay. We can't compete. We won't compete. We can't keep up. We won't keep down. We're still working on it, and I'm still working on it, and Sigi's is Into the Light, but I also like to recall the original impulse for it, which was the word revolution, as it appears on the walls in Cuba. I think the thing that links the 3 exhibitions together in many ways is the theme of space. and the ways in which our presence here in the gallery requires us to rethink notions of space, and the ways in which art practices enable us to rethink notions of human relationships and human nature relationships, as these are called into question by new ideas about space which create new forms of possibility. I also think that this question is interpreted in very different ways by the different exhibitions, but there are also many overlaps. For example, Landmarks calls into question the notion of the nation state, the space, the national space, as a kind of space that has been created by settler society in a society that has never really been decolonized. But it asks us to think about decolonization in perhaps a very different way to old narratives of decolonization, which foregrounded mainly sort of imitative ideas of the nation state. Something that Sigi refers to in her piece on Revolución, which recalls for me, as someone who comes from that generation of the post-colonial era, if you like to call it that, or the anti-colonial era, the idea of the Revolución for my generation was a utopic imaginary that we were all going to create, and that we were all somehow going to create. We were all swept up in this wonderful utopic ideal that actually was defeated. And so we come back to the memory of that utopic idea, and we assemble fragments of it across different spaces. And Sigi encourages us, or invokes in her work, a way of putting that past memory into dialogue with the contemporary moment here in a very different context, creating a kind of polyvocality and a kind of call and response between here and there, between there and here. And in another sense, we won't compete. We can't compete. We won't compete. We're working on it. Intervenes in the space of the gallery, creates an intervention in the space which has been traditionally a white male space for centuries, and they rupture the institutional space of the gallery in a different way. So we're seeing different interventions in space, and that might be a way that we might think of how some of these conversations might take place across the kinds of differences that all of the exhibitions invoke. So that's my opening, and I'm going to pass on to Sigi. Well, Sigi's a tremendous old friend. We know each other through the Cuban connection, which is sitting at the back there, in the form of Sigi's partners, who we call Chino, but who has a respectable European name, Jose Sewane as well. So we know each other through Cuba, and we would not probably have met if it wasn't for this Cuban connection, which we have because we're both wives of Cubans. But Sigi, in her own right, is a Caribbean person like myself. She was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I wasn't born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I was born in Jamaica, and received her MFA from the Art Institute, an art institute in Germany, which I will not attempt to pronounce. And she's kind of been obsessed for a long time with questions of time, art, and space. And this particular exhibition is the first, well, maybe not the first, but one of the first times that she has actually tried to articulate together some of the competing realities that she's had to negotiate in her life. She's tried to put into conversation a number of different kinds of realities that exist both spatially and physically, and this exhibition brings those together. So she teaches art at the University of Windsor, where she's a professor.
Would you like?
You need this?
So I thought I'd try a little experiment because usually I talk about the work and have pictures of the work up. So today I won't do that. I won't have any pictures, but I'm just going to talk about how my thought process happens and how I actually get to work. So I actually start with a German philosopher from where my mom is from, Novalis. He said philosophy is really homesickness. It is the urge to be at home everywhere, and I really, really identify with that. And I have to because I've had several homes and I still maintain several identities, including several passports, several bank cards, several of everything. So one way I navigate through all these different realities is I'm really interested in systems. Systems we create to understand and explain the world. So one of them, for instance, is the scientific system. You see upstairs in Soundings in a Way, you see scientific drawings of how we think animals find their way home. And I'm really fascinated because these are specialists that have been trying forever to figure out how this actually happens. But that's just one system. And the one closest to us is actually, I have to time myself so I know I'm behaving here.
I'm timing.
Okay, good. So one that's the closest is how we actually have the capacity to inhabit different bodies. So we have the spiritual, mental, emotional, physical, operating as one cooperative system. So in many situations we find ourselves where we're just like, I work in the university, so many times I find myself very mental, but the problem there is that you forget other sides of yourself. So ideally for the exhibition, I thought I wanted to kind of give little moments where you can engage in the different bodies that we inhabit. So given the premise that our framing is influenced by our geopolitical positioning, I'm going to address these with different spaces of that I've inhabited, and start with physical and emotional, and I start with the Virgin Islands, where I was born and grew up. So like Anna was saying, it's a post-colonial situation I was born into. I went to public school, so many times I found myself the only white person. And the way it actually works on an energy level is that when I went to Europe as a teenager, I would find myself in a room where I thought, oh, everybody is white in here. And I know this is a strange thing, and it still accompanies me. It's like something that just comes up. And I talked to a Jamaican once who went back home to Jamaica first time, who grew up in Canada, who had the very same experience. He actually came back from Jamaica early, and he said it was strange to be in a room full of black people. Now this guy had very dark skin. So I became very aware that there's a lot more to the discussion of racist politics than we just scratched the surface, I think. So Soundings in a Way, like the way Srimoy and I kind of set up the exhibition, is you walk in and you immediately get your positionings set up by once the photographs of my mother, which kind of show a little bit the context, and Srimoy actually really instigated that piece. And then the chair that's hanging up there, which, you know, it's kind of a bit strange to see a chair dangling up there, but it shows you that, you know, the moment we're off the ground, we're no longer grounded, we lose our stability. So that's how, you know, that's the entrance of how the exhibition is set up. I'm going to move on to mental. So a lot of physical, like when I think of the Virgin Islands, I think physical, I think the ocean, a lot of fighting as a kid, like claiming your space. And now it's surfing, you know, just being out there on the water and being physical. Came to Germany and was catapulted into a very mental space. And but it was very interesting because I went to study art, but philosophy was my main interest. And for instance, I'll just name a few people like Schiller. He thought a lot about the ideas of freedom and how through aesthetic experience we can achieve moments of freedom. And freedom has always been very important to me. So, and of course through art education, and here I am, I'm an art educator. Then of course, Ernst Bloch is someone I studied. He looked a lot at utopianism, and let me me see, I just do a little shortcut here, but Bertolt Brecht, techniques of highlighting the constructed nature of the theatrical event. And so just the idea that reality is really constructed, and I as an artist construct, but everybody has constructions that are, and then especially if we interface all these different constructions, a lot of misunderstandings happen. Peter Sloterdijk, another one, the idea of a good life as being embedded in a whole. That was kind of new at that time because everything was still very separate. Anthony Gramsci was very important, looking at the role of the intellectual. Like, why should I study? Why should I be smart? How can I take that to context where I work? That was very important. Then I got a scholarship for San Francisco, so I went to California. And the first thing I realized in California was that all the people that I'd studied were all men. And that was like a rude awakening. It was not a complete rude awakening. I already knew that there was a problem with that, but it's like I started to feel more at home, because in Germany it was tough because all my teachers were men. And they were older men, so it was a different generation. And some of them still thought that women couldn't be artists, or they couldn't be theorists, or, you know, stuff like that. Oh yeah. For instance, my art, like the colors I was using, I was painting at that time. They said, with those colors you can go back to the Caribbean where you're from. So basically the message was, the place I'm from doesn't really count. But when I grew up, it didn't count either, because we were in a third world and everything that was up north was better. So, so there's a bit of a dilemma right there. So of course the people, and so one of the teachers I had was Whitney Chadwick. You might know, some of you might know her. She's a feminist, and I just really loved interacting with her and looking at art and just seeing how we can really argue with images. And we don't always need to use language, but we can, just by how we position, and this is probably the curators here that will really, I speak to, is like, just by putting two things together visually, you're already setting up an argument. That's really something important I learned from her. And then women showed up, which was great. Julia Kristeva, Avita Ronell she taught at UC Berkeley, so I went to a lot of her lectures. I really loved the telephone book advocating the necessity of the unintelligible and the glitch. So I did glitch art back then, and and I questioned a lot of the art that we had been looking at, where the women were nude and they were usually reclining. And so a lot of my work was about the so-called male gaze. So that was kind of like what I was in, the male gaze and pornography and things like that. And I did a lot of stuff naked. That was that phase. Of course, it was another dilemma, because within feminism there were different groupings, and again, I didn't quite fit in, but I've never quite fit in. And so I think now I'm at a point where I feel like it's becoming more possible that people get together who actually don't fit in, and it's okay, or it's actually good. It's a good thing, like, to have a variety. And then Spivak, of course, the legacy of colonialism was very important for me to think about, and so I found thinkers that were actually quite current and that really helped me in positioning myself. So I am getting to the topic, representing oneself and another. So I'd like to create work that really emphasizes the intricate relationship between self and other through an exploration of dilemmas and unstable boundaries of the self. For instance, is there an authorial self? And that can actually never directly be revealed. It could be presented as a metaphor, but also only to a relative degree. In other words, self-representation always has to be mediated through the representation of others. Even the moment one thinks of oneself, that self has already become an other. So I talk about Bleached by Nostalgia, which is the piece when you walk in. That kind of sets up the context a little bit For instance, the title invokes the problematic of nostalgia and memory as it's a selective process. As we all know, it's very constructed. If I didn't have the photos that my mom had, and I probably already edited out some and I took some, I basically create a story that is a good narrative, but if I had had other pictures, I would have probably created another narrative. And then the idea of bleached, like when I was growing up, kids, when they wanted to bug me, they would say, yeah, they bleached you, or you got Clorox or something because of my skin color. So it has many readings. And let's see, how much time do I have?
I'll tell you, you have 5 more minutes.
Oh, good. So Spivak, what did I take away from that is probably the need to be really vigilant and to really look at our complicities, like we are complicit in any narrative we build or that other people build and bring us into, and to really look at that. And one of the pieces that I really thought about being complicit is Mírame pero no me toques, and which is probably my most complicated piece, and or the most brave one. And I think the way, because I have a lot of questions, is it okay to, for instance, film a ceremony and to film one that's actually not from my culture? And so there are a lot of questions around that, and yeah, but I am complicit. Like there's an important moment where I look at the camera and I'm very unstable, the way I look at the camera. And it's really also about the gaze that I was very interested in years before. I'm still am, it's like the viewer, and how I can kind of look at power relations when you're looking and being looked at. So, so what can we do? So one idea is to just retrace the history and itinerary of one's prejudices and learned habits, because we believe in everything we think. And that's one thing I learned in California when I started. I actually went to psychic school, and I learned the first day I went there, I was told, don't believe everything you think. And I was a big thinker, so I thought, I shouldn't believe all that. That was, that played a little bit with me, but that's been very important since then. So this is what Spivak calls a transformation of consciousness, a changing mindset. Others call it decolonization, big words, accountable positioning, etc. So that's kind of like the current way to find big words for something as simple as that. Also very important in California was a spiritual dimension, which is the practice of mindfulness. I had the privilege to meet fascinating people like Jack Kornfield, some of you might know, and looking at attention as one of our greatest tools that we have. And attention is actually something, as artists, we draw attention to something. Like if we present a piece of art, in that moment at least, we get someone's attention. And that is our biggest tool that we have. So the practice of that is, of course, important. So I started meditating, and that's why you see all those chairs, my obsession with chairs. It's about sitting, grounding the body, and coming to a place of mindfulness. And talking about moving through space, drifting like a boat without a rudder is if you're spaced out and not paying attention to mindfulness. So one of the fun stories of is the one of the puppy that I wanted to bring up, like a train, like meditation is like training a puppy. Like you tell the puppy stay, and he does it for a second, then he runs off. You tell the puppy stay, he stays. He goes off, he pees in the corner, comes back, makes a mess. But our mind makes much bigger messes. And so that's why I think it's very important to, find the time every now and then and just kind of collect and just start clearing all the clutter that's up there. So I'm fascinated with how we negotiate this space and create change, because that is a way we can create change. And so I'd like to end with an invitation to participate in my performance on the 24th. And it's called 10,000 Monarchs. It's dedicated to the 10,000, at once they counted 10,000 monarchs that took off from Point Pelee, and they fly all the way to Mexico. And I'm really fascinated, why do they even go to Mexico, and how do they find their way through any kind of temperature, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to, that day I'm going to be in trance, so I have my eyes closed, I'll be in deep, relaxed state, and then invite participants to come, and I will look at how they negotiate their space between home and the faraway, between being in the body and outside, and be between what they're aspiring and where they can be in the present. Thank you.
Introduce Andrea Fatona and, no, I'm lying, I'm getting it muddled again. Deirdre Logue and Allyson Mitchell. Allyson is my colleague at York University, and we've had the pleasure of working together on one committee so far, and probably will be working on some more in the future. So it's great to be here with her. She, as you probably will have gathered, is an associate professor at the School of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at York. But she runs this fascinating gallery called FAG with Deirdre Logue. And Deirdre is an artist, and I have picked up since I've been here that she made a number of marks on the spatial energies of this town, because I heard people saying how wonderful it was to have her back. So I picked up that piece of information in my Sherlock Holmesian moments last night, and so I'm going to turn over to them. They can talk, and I just want to say I've been to the FAG. It's a wonderful space. It's a garage space, and if you go there, you immediately start thinking, how can you get your hands on a garage to do the same thing?
Thank you. So in our 20 minutes today, we're going to talk very briefly about our own practices in relation to representing the self, our own art practices. Can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we're going to show you a video about the FAG Feminist Art Gallery that Deirdre and I run together. And then we're going to talk about our concept of the Feminist Art Collection that we've created, and this exhibition here at Windsor, at the Art Gallery of Windsor, is the second exhibition from that Feminist Art Collection. So we'll talk about working with the collection here in the gallery. So Deirdre and I both have long-running art practices where we do very differently, but with similar strategies, work on representing the self. Do you want to talk about your video work a little bit?
Okay. In fact, one of the last times I was in Windsor, I was in this room, and my work was showing on this screen. I work primarily in self-portraiture, using film and video, installation, sort of expanded forms of film and video. And the work is really, when you were talking about sort of the clearing of the mind, the sort of downloading some of that chaos. That's actually, people are always like, what do you make? It's like, I make the product of that downloading. My work is generally sort of about, it's about how we represent the self as subject, how we represent of the self, and how that self is consumed through media. The works are often, the portraits sit sort of right in the middle between comfort and trauma, excess and deficiency. They're works that are intended to sort of troubleshoot the in-between. And they're often also works that, even though I'm in them, follow in a tradition of performance for the camera and performance art, feminist performance art in particular, I work in the tradition of early conceptual art where, tapes were unedited. They just sort of, you would record the gesture of the moment for as long as you had the material and the space and time to do so. So it's a kind of a combination of performance, feminist and queer politics, video, art, and installation. So, Allyson's work is...
And it's a bit awkward.
I know, we're just going to figure this out.
We'll warm up.
Remember, we're working on
it. So I did not go to art school. I'm self-trained as an artist, but my work is informed heavily by feminist and queer theory, cultural studies, cultural theory. And I began doing work as doing performance artist and direct action. Worked with a group called Pretty Porky and Pissed Off, where we would do public performance work around body size acceptance, and that eventually morphed into a sculptural practice, which has resulted in things like a coven of gigantic lesbian feminist Sasquatch monsters, a recreation of the lesbian Her Street archives in Brooklyn, and most recently a gigantic installation and performance piece called Killjoy's Castle, a lesbian feminist haunted house in Toronto this fall, which was riffing. I can't believe nobody laughed at any of my titles, but that's fine. You guys want to take it that seriously, it's okay.
Still memorizing the Pretty Porky.
Okay. Still memorizing Pretty Porky, because I'm good. I'm thinking about it. So this haunted house I did was riffing on evangelical Christian haunted houses where people walk through and are taught about different sins for which if they commit they're going to go to hell. And this was a different kind of take on those politics. So the work that I do is about kind of a representing in sculpture and installation as well as film and video of the self, in terms of it not necessarily being specifically or explicitly autobiographical, but about a kind of attempt to make a public articulation of a knowing or understanding or learning about the world through theory and practice that's happening simultaneously in practice-based exhibition. So that was just a very short little bit about our practices, but we decided about 5 years ago, after having thought about it for a long time, to open a feminist art gallery. And it was after many years of feeling dissatisfied with the kinds of work that was being exhibited very locally in Toronto, the work that was being exhibited by the kinds of artists that were being shown, and rather than continuing to complain about it with our colleagues, which we all often do, we decided to not wait until we had the perfect circumstances, but to actually just plunge into trying to create a different kind of art gallery space that was simultaneously public, in that it was open to the public, but also private, in that it's in our home. And we ran the gallery for the last 4 years, and it immediately exploded outside of the space of the actual building that we created for it, and became a project that we've largely done through satellite exhibitions like the one here at the Art Gallery of Windsor.
We often try to talk as artists first and sort of give you a sense of what we both do to situate this as an artist project. We're not curators, and we're not directors, and we are not in charge of the future of feminist cultural production. However, to know that this is how art, this is in some ways a very good example of how art and activism have always run really interesting and productive parallels. Allyson started as an activist before she became an artist. I started as an artist and came to activism as part of, as Allyson described, kind of some sort of frustrations with the ways that the art world works, but also, because both of our individual practices are politically situated. you know, we understand the politics of the body, we understand the politics of gender, we in our own work already kind of embody these politics. It was a very natural transition for us. We are lovers, we are queer people, we are artists, and we are activists. For us to join together on a project of this nature, we're well seasoned as artists. We know how to put on shows, we know how to, you know, hang a painting, we know how to mobilize a community, set up a video projector. So when we decided to actually build a purpose-built building in our backyard and stage this project, both of our political animals got to run around as freely as we wanted in our own backyard. Still fenced in, of course, but and I think that spirit actually was what ignited the concept of the Feminist Art Gallery so quickly. People in Toronto, and I believe worldwide, and perhaps even here in Windsor, are ready to consider feminism and its definitions in the context of art in a very new way, to align themselves with the project of anti-oppression along with an art practice, as opposed to these sort of singular settings where, you know, artists work quietly and alone in a studio, and, you know, the rest of the world sort of goes on without them. I think artists are very ready to undo that. I also think that the Feminist Art Gallery as an idea is really meant to seed the idea in places all over. So we, in working in satellite, we can sort of take the idea all over the place, and people are, it's like, can you have your own Feminist Art Gallery? Absolutely. It's not a franchise, it's just this idea that feminist art galleries can exist all over the world and situate both art and activism in the same context.
And since we're about halfway through our time, we should show the video of the Feminist Art Gallery. It's a montage of images from the first 4 years of having the gallery open.
The collaboration of us, artists Deirdre, Logue, and Allyson Mitchell. Through FAG we host, we fund, we advocate, we support, we claim, and we make. The FAG in the garage in our backyard in Toronto, Canada. Due to the following circumstances, list umpteen statistics about how gender, race, selective homophobia, and class operate in the art world. We propose these slogans: we can't compete, we won't compete. And ask the following questions. Why would you want to be a winner in this hierarchical structure? And how do we both resist and reconcile our participation in this oppressive system of institutions, commerce, fame, and vocation? FAG is focused on a diverse community of individuals. FAG is committed to the cultivation of a new kind of sisterhood that isn't based on gender and privilege, and a new kind of brotherhood that isn't based on rape and pillage. Can't, won't is an acknowledgement of the dilemmas of feminist and queer cultural participation. We can't keep up, we won't keep down. Slideshow is a collage of images from our first 3 years that include people, gatherings, art documentation, activist demos, and sinks full of dirty dishes. We can't compete, we won't compete with systems we are a response to. Instead, we will try to create relationships. Thanks to the hundreds of activists, we are well aware of the real barriers created by white, male-centric nepotism. The name FAG was landed on as an irresistible acronym. FAG flags the fact that we are not a women's art project, but a feminist one, which is as equally concerned with inequities and oppression around gender as much as class, race, and ability. FAG is feminist in its resistance and in its insistence on closing the gaps between studio, gallery, art, activism, sociality, and home. We can't keep up, we won't keep down. Instead, we will collaborate, nurture, individual and into the accumulative, into the collective. At the end of every event, party potluck, angry letter writing frenzy, preschooling, cat petting, backyard screening, directive reading, contest sign thinking, incantation, herbal tea and gluten-free muffin top, artist talk. We ask that you make and leave your name tag with bag. Stuck now to the walls of the gallery, living room and kitchen, and until those walls come down, your name tag helps us and all the other visitors to fag realize how big this is and how big this could be. We can't compete, we won't compete. We can't keep up, we won't keep down. In an art system geared towards making a few privileged art stars in its everyday exclusions. At FAG, we tell each other about the people who matter to us. At FAG, we build a community not restricted by money, geography, or proximity. At FAG, we create a feminist and queer critical mass that's ready to push against the gallery walls to make them bend further and farther and faster. When you move beyond the singular, we move together beyond the individual and then into the accumulative, into the collective, in solidarity. Push against the gallery walls to make them bend further and farther and faster. When you move beyond the singular, we move together beyond the individual and into the accumulative, into the collective, in solidarity.
That we are agitators and instigators, but not representatives. The feminist and queer cultural community is, at least the, fragment of them are shown here in action, making the Feminist Art Gallery happen as a collective voice. The Feminist Art Gallery, after 4.5 years, I didn't think we were going to get away with it for 4.5 minutes, but here we are. And so, trying to push past the idea of being able to have a feminist art gallery, to have a feminist art foundation, a feminist art institution, a feminist art collection. There's all these other types of models that you want to start playing with and troubleshooting. So the feminist art collection became a natural and obvious way to further our commentary on what's missing from the art world, the art system, and in particular the museum and public gallery at the institutional level.
When we started the Feminist Art Gallery too, we knew that it wasn't, we wanted to kill it before it became institutionalized. So we never intended it to be a long-term project. It was always meant to be something that was around 3 minutes long. So 5 years long. But then we realized very quickly that the need for this project goes beyond 5 years. So we decided to move into this, roll it into another project, which is a Feminist Art Collection. And so the Feminist Art Collection, the exhibition here at the Art Gallery Windsor is curated from is a conversation between work that's here in the collection and work that exists in our Feminist Art Collection. And the Feminist Art Collection is meant to be this thing where we troubleshooted the idea with a group of young, emerging artists in Toronto at a gallery called Whippersnapper Gallery in 2 seminar discussion groups and asked them what would they want out of a feminist art collection. And one of the things that came out that was most interesting out of the conversation was that the difficulty of being, what is feminist art? How do you describe something as feminist? And so this is the question that we're exploring with the exhibition here, one that we just recently did at the University of Lethbridge. At the University of Lethbridge Gallery, we curated from the Feminist Art Collection using art that had text in it. So it's maybe the most simplest way to start thinking about how work can be described as feminist or political because it's didactic. It describes itself that way. And then this exhibition at the Art Gallery of Windsor, when we looked at the collection, not surprisingly, it is a problem in most institutional art collections. There's very little work by women, by people of color, that is politicized. And so we decided to work with abstraction, to work with, to think about, to have art from our collection that was about abstraction of identity, abstraction of bodies, in conversation with there is a huge element of the collection here at the Art Gallery Windsor, which is abstract paintings. So taking this work, which is out of a very specific movement or type of art that is very exclusionary, is a practice that, abstract painting as something that was very specific to kind of a white male art canon, and force that into a conversation with work that's trying to abstract in a different kind of way.
And I do want to lobby for the extra couple of minutes that we get, because
We had
set up the
fumbling.
video.
We had fumbling with the video.
You did?
Yeah. We're going to get 2 minutes out of that.
Okay, should we
2
take a
minutes.
popular vote?
2 minutes. Well, and just to,
Feminist collectors
yeah.
will have to take a vote.
I know. But we have consensus.
No, consensus, yeah.
Consensus. But just to follow up, I just wanted to the exhibition is upstairs, and I hope that you'll all go and see it. We see these actions as interventions into systems and spaces, and I think when we work with an institution, when an institution is willing to work with us, there are conditions that we present. The institution sort of agrees to participate in this project with us, and I think that the Art Gallery of Windsor, the Art Gallery of Lethbridge, and other organizations that we have worked with, including on different projects, but including places like the Tate Modern, their willingness, I think, is part of the transformation that I think is necessary, and that is kind of part of what's happening to spaces around that are built around cultural production. So there is a sort of a transformational notion in the exhibition as well. And I think that, you'll see animated lines on the floor connecting the work to other work in the institution that's not in the exhibition. And these are ways to sort of animate your role as an audience in the question of what is feminist art, what could a feminist art collection do, in fact, to contradict and counteract some of the masculinist and dominant and systemic problems with institutional collections. So it's a very exciting territory. There's a very active site for dialogue, and I think the Feminist Art Collection and the exhibition here is basically to be talked about with you.
Thank you. Now we're gonna hear from the last pair, which is Andrea and Susan, and they're going to be talking about landmarks. So over to you. I don't know how you're going to start.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out, and I'd like to thank Shimoy, the Art Gallery of Windsor, Sonia Balzac from the Thames Art Gallery, from which the exhibition originated. I'm a curator, I'm not an artist. I work with art, other people's art in space, to try to make meaning and to create narratives about the world. I'll tell you how I started my practice. I started my practice out of necessity several years ago, a long time ago actually, primarily because in public art galleries and artist-run centers, there were no representations of bodies like mine, racialized bodies, queer bodies. So out of necessity, I started to develop exhibitions. Started my work with an artist-run centers. My work's been really grounded by a number of theorists, like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, who take up issues of representation, Bell Hooks, who talks about Black feminism, by authors like Dion Brand. The text, What We All Long For, has been really quite instrumental in framing how I understand my work in the world. And so in a way, I'm going to say that my work really engages the collective self, the Black community, as a way to talk about my own identities. And so a lot of my work is really about the idea and notions of recognition. How do we sort of create conditions in which we can I can recognize myself, my communities can recognize themselves within the visual culture of Canada. So that's how I started. To date, I guess another really strong grounding for my work as well is a kind of post-structuralist understanding of the world. Foucault was quite instrumental in shaping the ways in which I think, and this exhibition upstairs, Landmarks, actually came into fruition through my reading The Order of Things. Really wanted to think about ideas and issues of classification, how Western classification shapes the ways in which we think about knowledge and power, the ways in which language shapes knowledge and power as well in the world. My work's really also shaped by the notion of diaspora, really the Black diaspora and the Black Atlantic. The ways in which Black bodies have been moved out of Africa for the sake of the development of capitalism, and the ways in which Black cultures have developed out of this really violent past. So my work, again, focuses on Blackness as one way of thinking through decolonizing methodologies and practices. Use Blackness as one way to think about what humanity could look like, and to imagine new ways in which we actually engage with each other. In a way, I'll call that, my work really takes up this idea of what might new socialities look like. How might we organize ourselves in relation to each other, but in relation to organic and non-organic, the living and the non-living within the space that we call the world. And so the exhibition upstairs is really trying to unpack some of these ideas. Decolonization as a trope and as a practice is really quite central in the work. And want to really taken for granted notions of how we create hierarchies and divisions between us. Looking at the similarities more so than the differences that separate us in the world. So the works upstairs really foreground systems of classification, the ways in which we create hierarchies, that really out of those hierarchies we actually create practices that are oppressive, practices that are based on power differentials, as I said before. And the ways in which our histories of the present can be unpacked. To look at how we've come to where we are today. To look at the continuities of our practices in the world and the discontinuities, but to also beg audiences, beg ourselves to think about new possibilities. And so for this exhibition, as I was putting it together and looking at all the works and the ways in which they engage with each other, I started to think about the possibility of the idea of the dream. Dreaming as a metaphor, but dreaming as an activity in the world. How might we dream of new ways of being together? How might we dream of new ways of engaging our differences in a productive form? So the exhibition, again, also looks at the ways in which land, the places in which we live, circumscribes the kind of cultures that we produce. To look at the specificities of place in shaping who we are. I'm really concerned at this point in time. As I said, I started off because of a lack, trying to fill a lack in the same way the fan is taking up those issues. So I see a lot of similarities in terms of our process, and I think in terms of our methodologies of trying to how we get there. But today, lately, I've been really quite interested in the ways in which what I would call the multicultural settler in Canada, those who came here under the guise of multiculturalism and multicultural policy, include in excluding the Indigenous body and include in erasing their calls for sovereignty. So the work I do today, I'm trying to find ways in which we can engage with what it means to actually create alliances and understand our responsibility in the world as racialized people who've got our own struggles around equality and our own struggles around being inserted and being recognized within the space called Canada. Quite concerned in ways in which we must understand how we come to dampen the calls of the indigenous peoples of this country. I'm also trying to see the ways in which we, as, again, racialized people, can actually have alliances with indigenous peoples around the world, not just in this geographical space, to, again, really reach towards what some people might call a kind of utopian today and tomorrow, but to really think through how we can work together to decolonize not just our minds, but our practices, decolonize our art practices as well. The works upstairs as well ask us to think through leveling these hierarchies between the human and the non-human. So in the works, you might notice that there are not very many bodies in it. What we see are animals. And animals take the place, help us to think through certain kinds of archetypes and how we can use them to move ourselves into another place in which we can level the hierarchies, in which, in the order of things, where humans are usually at the top of the apex, we see ourselves in symbiotic relationship with each other, that we see ourselves in relationship to those things unseen, seen and unseen, those things that are human, those things that are non-human, that they're to try to think of this world and the possibilities for a new future that sees us in dynamic relationship to each other. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. And we can talk about the work. I hope you do see the work upstairs, and we can think through the ways in which some of these ideas that I'm presenting to you are animated in the work. I really believe the works speak for themselves and help us to see these ideas, and actually how the work asks us to think about new ways of being together in this space.
It's gone through a transformation, and Andrew's created a lot of different exhibitions which have kind of really been significant in terms of how they've transformed what Canadian art is widely seen as. And now I'd like to turn over to Susan Gold, who also is a very significant presence here in Windsor. She's the former curator of the contemporary art, sorry, I'm lying again. She is the Professor Emerita of the School of Visual Arts at University of Windsor. And she works at 110 Park, which is a working space in downtown Windsor that stresses community art making, but also individual art practice. So over to Susan.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Honor, and thanks everyone. It's really nice to see your faces out there. Today I wanted to address the panel topic, which is representing oneself and another. The words that are associated with that topic, place, identity, and race, really don't have a resonance for me right now. But another description of the topic used the phrase relationship to the world. And that phrase resonated with me. Since we're not in the gallery, and since the work and what we're talking about is all upstairs in the gallery, and since the work in the gallery represents work that was developed by me over 10 years ago, I thought I would project a more recent painting over my head. So I think this painting represents the questions of disrupting place, race, and identity. I would like to speak a little bit about an artist's practice developing language and meaning in the work, and how does that happen? How do we develop a language, and how do we develop meaning in our work? Of course, we start with subject, and we use materials. So the materials I use are paint, canvas, mylar, ink, and the subject lately has been sites that move me in natural history collections. And also my response to the photographs that I take in those places. and the photographs that I take become my own collection. I allow my material and body gestures to do a lot of the thinking for me. Thinking as it occurs in my work is more rambling than analytical and more referential than linear. I am trained to be reflexive. I think it's a contemporary condition of art making. I am trained to implicate myself in everything I do. But I need surprise. So I plan surprise into my work, and I allow surprise into all aspects of my process. This material process and thinking process becomes my experience, and it is part of how I understand the world. So in my experience with landmarks, curatorial practice comes into play, and I think since we have a curator, a wonderful curator on the panel, I think that should come into our discussion today. In a curated exhibition, I am placed in a position of looking at my work as regards the other work in the group and through the ideas of the curators and writers. So it becomes another conversation. I could choose to allow the work to not enter that conversation and without me as the artist. But I'm still alive, and I am a social being, and I do long for surprise, so I have made landmarks part of my experience. In curated projects, the artist is backed off behind one more layer, and the work is taken up by the curator, and then the artist is asked to speak on panels about what? So, I begin by searching for commonalities and difference, and there are many commonalities. And the idea of searching for commonalities and difference is a very familiar scientific practice, and I tend to imitate other practices in my work, and I'm imitating scientific practice by looking for sameness and difference. But I'm also haunted by those curatorial words, place, identity, and race. And so I'm attempting to put myself back into the place of the work upstairs. This is early work selected by the curators from over 10 years ago. And from what I recall about that time, I was, as a photographer, was capturing the gaze of the animal and reifying or reanimating its authority. So the exhibition, which took place at which was organized by the Thames Gallery, I felt like it was a trajectory of gazes across the gallery, much the same as the exhibition on the third floor is a trajectory of gazes. And as a painter, I was of course conversing with my materials and with the surface. I'm obsessed with the surface that I'm using, the surface of the wall, and moving in and out. So now the same paintings find their place in landmarks upstairs, and I see the animals now as entry points, and the marks as interpretive moments. So I am speaking in those paintings through the subject, which is the animal taxidermy, and the mark is my vehicle. So I've come to see the paintings in a different way. This association, or conversation, has broadened my thinking about my work, and the association with amazing artists and landmarks and Into the Light, and We Will Not Compete, and the curator's vision. So now again, we're in another discussion, which I hope will broaden out those themes, and that's the panel today. And this is a real conversation, not a meta conversation. So I'll just let it go as that. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully I can do this without making any more mistakes with titles or names. Or lying. So there are a number of things that I think for me jump out as a result of what's been said, and I just want to kind of throw them out to you, and maybe you can take them up. The biggest one I think has to do again with space and the ways in which the way that space actually structures our experiences and our relations to each other, our sense of possibility. And space here in the sense of landscape, but also space in the sense of the built environment as well as the natural environment. Space in terms of the kinds of ideological spaces that we create, both in an attempt to reproduce our lives, but also in an attempt to overturn the kinds of orthodoxies that come to structure our lives. So space as a number of different things. Also space as something that is itself structured in relation to hierarchy and difference. And the important thing I think here is that difference is conflated with hierarchy often in the Western imagination. So we have a hard time thinking about difference without the hierarchy. Okay, whoever you are, we're soon done. Then, in deference to my friend, the human versus the non-human, but also the human versus the more than human. And so, thinking about the human in conversation with or in communication with the non-human, but also with what is invisible, what is more than human, and what also troubles those classifications in and of themselves. So displacement, but also movement across binaries and within and across and over boundaries. And then also what I think Susan gestured to at the end here when she kind of identified the limitations of the verbal in shaping our world. And I think that if you've been upstairs, you'll see that in a way our conversation only kind of calls our attention to what verbal conversation is unable to do, in that there is a kind of disorderliness about the performance, the performative moment of the visual. And so there is always something which visual art enables us to become aware of that is difficult to represent in the confining categories of verbal language. And that therein lieth the eternal surprise, this eternal accident that is always disrupting and that is always playfully forcing us to confront ourselves as other to ourselves. So there's a whole dog's breakfast for you. So over to you now, and please feel free to ask questions.
Or destabilizing, that's another word that came up, or stabilizing and disrupting and intervening. And so it would, I'd love to hear each of you perhaps speak a bit about how you negotiate that, those notions in your practices, spatially or conceptually or both.
I could just quickly say that, when the Feminist Art Collection was conceived, one of the things that it's setting out to do is to make the institution more disorderly. It's not simply going in and sort of misbehaving inside this space in this sort of temporary way by trying to critique. It is a more productive exercise, and it does ask the institution to do things that perhaps it wouldn't normally do. So, the idea initially was to go into institutions with requests for it to support the collection in its own unruly sort of state. So things like loan agreements and some of the very traditional and sort of hard and fast rules of institutions. The Feminist Art Collection is owned by enablers. It's owned by a community. It's not. We don't own the work. The work is kind of pulled. It's totally decentralized. It's not in one place. It's from all over. So some of the work is our work in our home that we've purchased or acquired over the years. Some of the work we acquired for this exhibition. Some of the work is borrowed from other people who participate in the Feminist Art Collection. So, an institution's like, well, where's this coming from? It's like, well, it's coming from all of us. It's coming from everywhere. And they're like, but who's going to sign the loan forms? So I think sometimes it depends on who the participants are, but bringing the disorderliness can actually be a very finely tuned, very strategic, very neat and tidy question that is about power and about authorship, ownership, and all sorts of things. And it's placed just right in the right moment, in the right setting, in the right time to, in a way, explode everything. So it's the question of the disorderly, I think, is really important. The model that we propose to institutions is the opposite of their model. And so everything you do, we undo. And it can be it can seem very, you don't have to have a big, complex plan to be the thorn in the foot, that makes it difficult to walk. You still walk, but it hurts a bit. So it's just this idea that it doesn't have to be this monster notion. It can be very finely tuned and peaceful.
Well, it requires that people who, institutions are just buildings with people in them. And so it's not disruption in an anarchist kind of way where we're coming into sledgehammers and saying like, we're taking over. But it requires that there's people like Catherine or like Srimoy who work within an institution to say, we want to work with you. It's not adversarial or it's not a fight. It's more figuring out how to make it work. But I'm going to hear what you have to say.
As my job as an artist in my studio is really a job of maintaining contradiction and living in that space of contradiction. And sometimes it happens, sometimes you're surprised, but many times you have to strategize and invent strategies to maintain that contradiction. And as simple as turning out the lights and tracing, as simple as overlaying one thing on another that you don't know what the result will be, to break down images and create. Actually, when things happen in the work that aren't going so well, that's a good thing. That's where you break through into territory that you're not familiar with. So as an artist, I think you have to actually strategize to bring disorder into the studio when you're working.
So I guess my work approaches this idea of disorder on a number of levels, both spatially and conceptually. In the first instance, because I come from an activist background in relation to pushing against the institutional frames that have kept racialized and queer bodies out of those spaces, I'm really kind of concerned with creating fissures so that we can open up a little space and rush in and mess it up. So in a way, it's not just to mess it up, it's also to rush in and reorder. So it's not just about disorder, it's about creating another kind of order that really pays attention to shifting, again, hierarchies and shifting business as usual within institutional spaces, but also in relation to the audience, right? Because I'm very concerned as a curator with presenting work in space to make meaning within spaces by the ways in which works are positioned, right? So it's also trying to shift the ways in which we present work and the types of work presented. Another kind of disordering and reordering that my work takes up is really around replacing histories of racialized productions within a frame of modernism to mess up that space in what we think modernity is, right? And how we as racialized bodies have participated in this whole project of modernity. Up until now, we've always been outside of it. So I think messing up and making messy that space is by inserting these things and these people, these bodies, these objects that weren't supposed to be there in the first place. In another way as well, particularly conceptually in relation to this exhibition, it's also trying to go against and outside these spaces of what we consider to be logical spaces, to actually try to think through new epistemologies that come from and different kinds of ways of thinking around what logic is or this place outside of logic. So I'm really interested in what happens if we tap into spaces that are completely outside of what we know as logical spaces. And in my mind, that is a kind of messing up, right? Messing up in order to find something else. So that's how I take up this idea of disorderliness, but also I think it's also important to reach for a space of a different kind of order. So not just to create disorder, but to find and reach further and envision something else after that.
That's a big one to follow. So I was just thinking about some examples. Disorder and destabilizing are really important to me in my work, and the way I do that is how I work with the viewer who comes to the show and to see the work. And so I'm always thinking of how they would look and how they would be in physical relationship to the work. For instance, the chair's hanging, so you know, the body gets a little uneasy because we're used to sit on it, and so that's already a bit of a messing up. Then the horizon on one of the pieces is actually above, so the sky is below and the water is above, so things got turned upside down. Then, of course, in Olofi, in that story, what I'm attracted to is the idea of messing things up in a creation, like it's a creation myth, but then things don't really work out, and that's where, in conflict, that's where new things happen, because people have to start negotiating, and they have to get out of the mess. Like if you're constantly stuck in the mess, there's no movement. And then in Into the Light, of course, it's all about the word of the big ideas, and I know each one in this room probably has some big idea they went by, or some ism that they are feel strongly about. And we go through the day, we get distracted, we lose contact, we lose track, and then the idea shows up again, and then it's gone again. But it kind of helps us to navigate through space, but it's important to have interruptions on the way. And then, for instance, in Soundings, in that piece where we don't have a horizon, or we just look down or we look up, but the viewer doesn't really have stability in a way that they can actually, like when you're sailing, it's always important to see the horizon, otherwise you get seasick. So growing up near the ocean, I'm always thinking about the horizon, and I know that when I start to mess with that, for the viewer, they need to then find their own stability. So when you only look down or only up, you will need at some point to be able to look far and to stabilize the body. And then in Mírame pero no me toques, it's also about the viewer, like the role of the young men or young boys. They are there to kind of disrupt, like I'm kind of looking at the ceremony, but I constantly get distracted by them, so I'm not kind of like pulled into that narrative. And of course, one idea behind that is the question of ownership, like the viewer starting to feel like they own the image that they're looking at. And that's impossible because these kids basically by challenging the viewer, they constantly step in and kind of interrupt. And it's like, I want them gone because they're so in my face, but it's very conscious that I put them there. So those are some of the examples of how I work with that.
Oh, we have lots, I'm sure.
I think there'll be lots of questions and just giving people a chance to.
Well, I'm just wrestling with the concept here because it's interesting to hear how so many of the artists on the panel here today are seeing the artist as an agent of change within institutional culture. And so I wonder how we might reflect on that role across a broader spectrum of time, because in fact, artists have been at the center of a number of institutions that they've formed. So take, for example, in Canada, the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts was the project of the artists of this country. And by extension, they also pushed for the formation of the National Gallery of Canada. There's also a tradition of leaders of galleries like this one, having been for very long stretches of time being directed by artists. Then, for example, Ken Saltmarsh, Claire Weiss, Tara McDonald, Hamilton, and so forth. Then we've also got this tradition of the artist-run culture, the artist-run center that's now become institutionalized. So I'm just interested in us thinking about what that long durée looks like as we kind of push at this play of the artist both creating and resisting the institution.
So I think we have people who are coming at this from very different angles. So I'm going to ask you guys to start because I think in your work there's very much a sense of the institutions and the social movement and the kind of dialogue that the social movement enables within institutions while also challenging and transforming. And then I think for Sigi, who sees herself very much as a sort of outsider to social institutions, there's a different way of engaging. So I'm going to come to you next and then maybe end with you guys who are sort of the synthesis of both in many ways. So yeah, social movements, which was something I had hoped would come up in the discussion. How do we think about art in relation to social movements, and can you have institutional change without having social movements that are particularly provocative? And how do social movements themselves become their own orthodoxies? Here's a mic there.
Go ahead, honey. Well, when you were talking, I was thinking about the fine, always feeling like somebody who's trying to foster work that is disruptive to social order, to hegemony, to hierarchies, and the struggle with then working with the very institutions that we see as most often the ones that would reinforce those hierarchies and that hegemony. And in that trajectory that you're talking about around artist-led movements, getting ossified or co-opted or stale. It's a struggle in wondering, especially in using Feminist Art Gallery and our experience as the only thing that I really know, we started off 4 years ago as this thing that was specifically neighborhood oriented, that was completely independent. We ran the exhibitions through a matronage program where artists were always paid, and actually Honor was one of our matrons for an exhibition. And we didn't depend on any kind of funding. We've never applied for grants, even though we could. Deirdre's a professional grant writer, so we wanted to. we could have that money. But we wanted to be independent, and we wanted it to be a public institution or a public organization that was privately funded through public funding that wasn't tax dollars, but actually people directly giving money to the exhibitions, to the artists. This was pre-Indiegogo, and I mean, it was 4 years ago, which seems like it was pre this kind of fundraising that people do. And then within the first year, we were invited to do a project with the Tate Modern, and then we were invited to do a project with the Art Gallery of Ontario, and then we were invited to do a project with the Power Plant and Art Gallery of York University, and saw very quickly this micro world that we were creating that was meant to be feeding and fostering a very tangible community into this thing that got exploded really quickly. And we couldn't turn down an offer from the Tate Modern, because what it would do for the artists that we were working with, even though, so we were invited to do a workshop, and I'll be really brief, but we were invited to do a workshop with them, and we decided to call it an axe grinding workshop, and we pulled in artists that live in the UK and some artists from Canada who would never be on the radar of the Tate Modern, and asked them if they would be interested in doing a kind of cabaret style presentation of their art to an audience of international queer curators who are interested in queer and feminist art. And we paid them. So on their CVs, they could write that they had been commissioned by Tate Modern to do a performance. And then whatever ladders that they wanted to climb, they would have more access to climbing those ladders. They could, whether it was applying for grad school or jobs or grants or not, just having the self-esteem as an artist, knowing that they were recognized in whatever sneaky way, through whatever collaboration with our little project, that they could say that they were a part of that space, and what it does for somebody who's working in relative invisibility to then have that sense of themselves as artists. So it's always a compromise to work with institutions, and then also the way that social movement art gets aestheticized or co-opted so that an institution can say, we're working with these communities of people, even though they're not actually collected, or they're not the actual big banner exhibitions that get to have a wraparound sign on the outside of the institution, but a very small, short exhibition in a kind of a sliver of the institution. So, that's a long answer to what you just asked. I want to shut up because I want to hear what other people have to say. I've got more to say about it.
Yeah, kind of balking at your heels. Hold on a minute. You next.
I think I'm a little lazy, so what I would do, being a nomad, is I would go to geographic locations where what I'm interested in is actually has an audience. And so some of the things that I couldn't really figure out in Germany were very figure-outable in California. And let me see what that was. One thing was, for instance, sexual politics. That was something I was really interested in. In Germany, it was still the phase of big, high Marxism. And I always made mistakes, like I was found reading Trotsky, so I was out. Always there was a problem. So that's, like talking about institution, that's also an institution for me, knowledge. And for instance, feminism, another problem, like I didn't want to paint with my menstrual blood, so I was out of certain groups there. Like there was always a problem. And California was actually probably the first place where it was a little easier, because it's a very mixed society. And but one thing that was missing there was, for instance, thinking about my Caribbean past, and that's very good in Canada, because especially since I met you, for instance, but I was introduced to a Caribbean community of thinkers, writers, artists, and so now I'm here, and now that's what I'm working on.
So my own work comes out of Black activism and Black arts activism. So I'm keenly aware around this idea of social movements and the need to develop critical mass on the ground if we're going to have any shifts within institutions. We not only as cultural producers and artists, we can't do it on our own. And so the movement I came out of was a movement in which the actors and players in the social realm in terms of their pushback against police brutality, their pushback against the lack of education for Black children in Toronto, were the same players who were artists. The artists were no separate and different than the folks on the ground. A number of them bleed over